RomCalms, where romance and relaxation meet. Subscribe for a new romance novella every week. Reel to Reel, presented by RomCalms. Chapter 1. Grace Montrose was perched on a plush velvet chair in the office of her slick Hollywood manager. The room was filled with an air of tension and anticipation as Grace awaited whatever news her manager had for her. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the ticking grandfather clock against the wall. Leonard sat across from her, his face arranged into what he probably thought was a reassuring smile. His hazel eyes held a glint of mischief that made Grace even more nervous. "Grace," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the spacious room adorned with expensive artwork and golden plaques. "I have an idea that could potentially shoot your career straight to the moon." Grace lifted an eyebrow, crossing her arms over her chest defensively. She had known Leonard long enough to know that his ideas were not always conventional or even ethical. Her mind started racing with possibilities as she tried to prepare herself for whatever Leonard had planned this time, but nothing could have prepared her for what came out of his mouth next. "I want you to date Liam Stone." The words hung heavily in the air between them as Grace stared at him incredulously. She wondered if she'd heard him correctly. "Liam Stone? You have to be kidding me," she said, hoping desperately that there was another Hollywood star bearing the same name. Leonard nodded vigorously, confirming her fears. He seemed unbothered by the horrified expression on Grace's face and continued enthusiastically explaining his plan. "Yes, it's perfect. You're on the brink of making it big and his starlight hasn't been burning quite as bright lately. What better way to put your names in the magazines than a hot new romance?" Grace sunk back into her chair, feeling like all air had been sucked out of the room. She knew Leonard was only doing what he thought best for her career, but dating Liam Stone felt like diving headfirst into shark-infested waters. "But we hate each other," Grace protested weakly, hoping that fact alone would dissuade Leonard from his ludicrous plan. "Even better. It's the classic story of enemies turned lovers. The public will eat it up." Leonard's eyes were alight with excitement, making him look more like a child planning a prank than a seasoned Hollywood manager crafting a career strategy. Grace took in a deep breath, the reality of the situation sinking in. She knew this was not going to be easy. Their rivalry was well known throughout Hollywood, their mutual disdain as notorious as their acting talent. But if feigning affection for Liam could help propel her stagnant career forward, was she willing to pay such a hefty price? Leonard must have sensed her internal struggle because he leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk earnestly. "This could be your big break, Grace." And with that simple sentence, the seed of doubt was planted in Grace's mind. Could she do it? Could she bear pretending to love someone she couldn't stand? Or perhaps more importantly, was she ready for what may come after? The room fell into silence as Leonard gave Grace time to mull over his proposition. His words echoed in her mind. "Your big break." It seemed like an offer too enticing to refuse. As if standing at the edge of a precipice, Grace steeled herself. If this was what it took to achieve her dreams, then so be it. Still reeling from her decision, Grace found herself in a posh, upscale restaurant in the heart of Beverly Hills. The elegant chandeliers above cast a soft glow on the patrons, illuminating their faces as they laughed and sipped expensive wine. It was an arena where Hollywood's brightest stars came to shine even when off-duty, and tonight, Grace was here for a rendezvous with Liam Stone. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a wild drum as she caught sight of him. He was seated at a secluded corner booth, engrossed in his phone but looking every bit the star he was, effortlessly charismatic. "Montrose," he greeted coolly as she approached, standing briefly to acknowledge her before returning to his seat. His eyes bore into hers with an intensity that caused her heart to flutter momentarily. "Stone," she replied with equal frostiness, masking her nerves behind a veil of indifference. They were rivals after all, and old habits die hard. There was an awkward pause before Liam broke it by calling for the waiter. Ordering drinks seemed like the safest option at that moment. Dealing with their mutual animosity required some liquid courage. "So," he began once they were alone again, leaning back against his chair while swirling his whiskey glass nonchalantly. "Leonard has told you about our Arrangement? Grace nodded tersely and took a sip of her wine to soothe her parched throat. Yes. And you agreed? There was surprise evident in his voice, though he tried hard to keep it neutral. I did. Her response came out more defiant than intended, causing him to raise an eyebrow in silent query. An uncomfortable silence descended upon them again, until Grace decided she'd had enough of this dance around pleasantries. She leaned forward slightly and looked him straight in the eyes. Liam, she began determinedly, we don't have to like each other, but we need to be professional about this. We're both aware that we're doing this for our careers and nothing else. Liam seemed taken aback by her straightforwardness, but recovered quickly, allowing a small smile to play at the corner of his lips. I agree, Montrose, he acquiesced, raising his glass in a mock toast. Their evening progressed slowly from there, filled with more awkward silences and forced conversations. They discussed their upcoming appearances and how they would tackle unexpected questions about their sudden relationship. As the night wore on, Grace found herself observing Liam more closely. Behind his nonchalant demeanor, there was an air of loneliness that touched her unexpectedly. It was as if beneath the facade of Hollywood's bad boy lay a man yearning for something more than fame and adulation. For the first time since their rivalry began, Grace felt her animosity towards him wavering slightly, replaced by a hint of empathy. But she brushed it off as an effect of the wine dancing in her head. The meeting ended on a cordial note, with them agreeing to maintain professionalism despite their differences. As she watched Liam leave the restaurant under the soft moonlight, Grace couldn't help but wonder what this faux relationship had in store for them. As Grace stepped out into the cool Los Angeles night, she was consumed with the gravity of her decision. The city lights twinkled like distant stars, their soft glow casting long shadows on the deserted streets. She moved silently through them, lost in thought. She had agreed to a farce, a pretense that would thrust her directly into the constant glare of Hollywood's spotlight. Every move she made, every word she spoke would be scrutinized by millions, critiqued by those who knew nothing about her or Liam beyond what they saw on their screens. Yet this was part and parcel of being in the industry, an industry where reality was often stranger than fiction. Her heart rebelled against the idea of faking affection for a man she barely tolerated. Yet another part of her, the part that yearned for success and recognition, whispered that it might not be so bad after all. Upon reaching home, a modest apartment nestled in one quieter corner of LA, she found herself drawn to the window. The city lay spread before her, a vista of lights and dreams. Dreams that often came at a price. Was she willing to pay hers? Chapter 2. The night was enigmatic, brimming with hushed whispers and flashing lights. Grace clung to Liam's arm, her smile as radiant as the diamonds gracing her neck. They had arrived at the red carpet premiere of a much-anticipated movie, marking their first appearance as Hollywood's newest power couple. Her heart pounded in sync with the shutter clicks of cameras, while she tried to keep her anxiety concealed behind an effervescent facade. Smile, Liam whispered in her ear just before they stepped onto the crimson carpet spread before them, like a blanket of expectation. His breath was warm against her skin, causing an unexpected shiver to run down her spine. She turned to him, shooting him a look that clearly said, I know what I'm doing. Yet she found herself reassured by his slightly trembling hands on hers. It meant he was just as nervous as she was. They made their way slowly along the carpet, stopping occasionally for interviews and snapshots. Their smiles never wavered and their gazes locked with each other every so often, all part of their well-rehearsed act. Amidst all this, Grace couldn't help but notice how easily Liam drew people in with his charisma. Reporters hung on to his words while fans screamed his name. As they navigated through the sea of flashing lights and eager faces, Grace found it more challenging than she'd anticipated to keep up the pretense amidst probing questions from reporters about their sudden romance. The evening wore on like a well-scripted play, practiced smiles here, shared laughter there, until they finally made it inside the venue away from prying eyes. Once inside, Liam loosened his grip around her waist but didn't let go completely. You okay? He asked softly. Grace nodded, though she felt anything but okay. The entire charade felt like a game she didn't know the rules to. Yet she was aware that this was just the beginning of what she had signed up for. She plastered a smile on her face and turned to him. "Let's do this." As they made their way deeper into the crowd of Hollywood's elite, Grace realized that this was now her reality. A world painted with illusions and make-believe, and at its center stood Liam Stone, Hollywood's bad boy turned lover. Throughout the night, Grace kept reminding herself to breathe easy and play along. But as she looked at Liam, who seemed so comfortable in his role, she found herself longing for an authenticity that was missing amidst all this pretense. The night ended with applause and laughter ringing in her ears long after they left the venue. Their debut as a couple had been a success, but it left Grace wondering if success always came with such a hefty price tag. The high of the premiere had worn off, leaving behind a trail of exhaustion and a relentless echo of their public personas reverberating in their minds. It was in this state that Grace found herself sitting across from Liam in the dimly lit confines of her apartment, sipping on a vodka cranberry she had made for them. A silence hung between them, thickened by the night's events and loaded with unspoken words. "We need to talk." She finally broke the quietude, her voice barely above a whisper, yet clear enough to cut through the tension. Liam nodded, swirling his drink without meeting her gaze. His usually expressive eyes now masked under shadows cast by his furrowed brows. The confidence he usually portrayed to the world was nowhere in sight. Instead sat a man wrestling with his own demons. "We can't let personal feelings interfere," she began, mimicking his action and focusing on the amber liquid swirling inside her glass. "This arrangement needs consistency." He looked up then, meeting her gaze squarely. "Agreed," he said simply. Then, after a moment's pause, added, "We need to spend more time together, off camera." Grace blinked in surprise at his suggestion, but quickly composed herself, not wanting to give him any advantage over her emotions. "Are you suggesting we practice being a couple?" she asked skeptically. "What I'm suggesting is we get comfortable around each other so that our chemistry isn't forced on camera," he stated matter-of-factly, as if they were discussing lines for an upcoming scene, not terms for their faux relationship. She considered him silently before responding. He was right about one thing. There needed to be some semblance of authenticity in their interactions, or else they risked falling apart under public scrutiny. "Okay," she conceded eventually, "but we set boundaries. This is purely professional." "Purely professional," he repeated, raising his glass in a mock toast. She mirrored his action and clinked her glass with his. As the night wore on, they found themselves discussing everything from their acting careers to their favorite films. Slowly but steadily, they were chipping away at the walls of animosity that had stood between them for years. Their conversation flowed like a gentle stream, unhurried and meandering yet meaningful nonetheless. Grace discovered that beneath Liam's Hollywood persona was a man passionate about art and cinema, while Liam found a woman who was fiercely dedicated to her craft behind Grace's unyielding exterior. By the end of the night, they'd agreed on certain rules for their arrangement: no personal questions during public appearances, dedicated time for couple practice every week, and most importantly, maintaining professionalism at all times. As she said goodbye to him at her doorstep, Grace couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation towards what lay ahead. Chapter 3. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over Grace's apartment. It was an unusually quiet day in her otherwise bustling life, filled with phone calls, script reads, and auditions. Today, she found herself welcoming unexpected company. Liam arrived promptly at 8 in his signature black Bentley. He was dressed casually in jeans and a white button-down shirt that starkly contrasted against his tanned skin and dark hair. As he stepped out of his car, Grace couldn't help but notice how different he looked outside the dazzling lights of Hollywood. He seemed more real. "Evening, Montrose," Liam greeted with a grin, holding up a bottle of wine as a peace offering. His green eyes shone brightly under the setting sun, emitting an earnest warmth that felt foreign to Grace. "Good evening, Stone," she returned his smile cautiously as they made their way inside her apartment. They spent the evening going over new scripts and discussing potential roles, both individually and as Hollywood's newest power couple. Their conversation flowed surprisingly easy without any traces of their initial hostility or rivalry. Grace noticed Liam's eyes light up when he spoke about acting, and it reminded her that beneath his playboy persona was a man passionate about his craft, passionate enough to keep trying, despite falling from grace once already. As they continued their discussion late into the night over glasses of expensive wine, Grace came face to face with an unexpected realization. She was beginning to understand Liam Stone. For all the years they'd known each other professionally, and for all their rivalry, they'd never really gotten to know each other personally. Tonight, though, for perhaps the first time ever, Grace saw past Liam Stone, the charming actor everyone loved, and caught glimpses of just Liam, the man who loved acting more than he loved being a star. As the evening wore on, she found herself listening intently to Liam, absorbing his words and his passion. In doing so, she realized that they were not as different as they had once thought. They both shared a deep love for acting, and an even deeper fear of losing their place in the industry they so dearly loved. As she bid goodnight to Liam and watched his car disappear down her driveway, Grace couldn't help but feel a slight flutter in her stomach. For the first time since agreeing to this arrangement, Grace felt something other than animosity towards Liam Stone. She felt respect. The following week found Liam and Grace in the confines of his luxurious penthouse suite, rehearsing their roles for an upcoming movie. Their time spent together off-camera was becoming surprisingly frequent, and the tension that once filled their shared space had significantly reduced. Liam lounged on the plush couch, script in hand, while Grace paced around the room, reciting her lines with fervor. He watched her intently, his gaze holding a newfound respect. She was nothing like the women he usually surrounded himself with. She was fierce, ambitious, and unapologetically stubborn. "I think we've got it," Grace declared after another successful run-through. She looked at Liam expectantly, waiting for his approval. He nodded, setting down his script and meeting her gaze. "Yeah," he agreed quietly. "We do." Their eyes held each other's for a moment too long before Grace cleared her throat awkwardly and turned away to gather her things. The room fell silent as they both grappled with the unexpected tension that suddenly hung in the air between them. Underneath the bright city lights streaming through the glass windows of Liam's apartment, they stood at opposite ends of a fine line, one they'd drawn themselves but were now hesitant to cross. "So," Liam began, uncertainly breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Same time tomorrow?" Grace shot him a small smile over her shoulder as she slung her bag over it. "Bright and early," she responded before leaving him alone in his penthouse suite. That night, as she lay awake in bed staring at her ceiling fan spinning lazily above her head, Grace couldn't help but replay their interactions from earlier today and all those days before when they had spent together off camera in her mind. She remembered how his face lit up when he spoke about acting, how he listened attentively as she shared her deepest fears and dreams related to their profession, and the way his laughter echoed throughout the empty spaces of either his apartment or hers, filling them up with a warmth she hadn't realized she missed until now. As much as she tried to push away these unexpected emotions bubbling within her chest, Grace couldn't deny the truth any longer. She was beginning to respect Liam Stone, not just for his acting skills, but also for the man he was when there were no cameras around. One evening, as the sun painted the sky with hues of orange and pink, Grace sat on Liam's balcony overlooking the city. She held a script in her hands, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The sound of soft footsteps behind her caused her to turn around. "So you're here," Liam said, with an unmistakable note of relief in his voice as he walked towards Grace. "You were looking for me?" she asked with raised eyebrows. "I was," he admitted. He took a seat beside her on the lounger and sighed heavily. It was moments like this that stirred something within Grace. Moments when Liam let down his guard and allowed himself to be vulnerable. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently. Liam nodded slowly but remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "It's just, I've been feeling sort of lost lately," he confessed quietly. Grace turned to face him fully now, concern etched clearly on her features. "Lost?" she echoed softly. He gave a humorless chuckle before continuing. "I know, it sounds ridiculous coming from me. I have everything I could want, right? But not happiness, Grace finished for him gently after a beat of silence hung between them. Exactly, he admitted quietly. I've spent so much time chasing the Hollywood dream that I lost sight of why I got into acting in the first place. It wasn't for the fame or the money, it was because I loved it. Grace watched him, her heart aching at his confession. She reached over to cover his hand with hers, giving it a comforting squeeze. Liam, she said softly, you're one of the most talented actors I know. Don't let this town make you forget who you are. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, Grace saw something flicker within, something that looked suspiciously like hope. Thank you, Grace, Liam murmured sincerely. Their moment was interrupted by the shrill ringing of Grace's phone from inside the apartment. She sighed, but got up to answer it nonetheless. When she returned to the balcony minutes later, she found Liam staring off into space, the city lights reflecting in his emerald eyes, making them shine brighter under the moonlit sky. Something about this image tugged at her heartstrings. As she bid Liam goodnight and retired to her guest room in his apartment, a place that was starting to feel more like home than her own apartment, Grace couldn't help but wonder how much more complicated their lives were about to get. They were treading on dangerous ground here, forming real connections amidst a world built on pretense and lies. Yet as she drifted off to sleep that night with thoughts of green eyes and shared laughter echoing in her mind, Grace realized she wouldn't have it any other way. Chapter 4. The blazing Californian sun cast warm golden light across the beach as Grace and Liam posed for their staged photo shoot. Their smiles were as bright as the shimmering ocean behind them, their hands intertwined in a show of perfect unity. Cameras clicked incessantly around them, capturing each moment of feigned intimacy. All right, beautiful people, let's try something different, called out the photographer, a small man with round glasses perched precariously on his nose. Liam, lift Grace into your arms like you're about to carry her into the sea. Despite the absurdity of the request, they complied. She felt his strong arms wrap around her waist and hoist her up effortlessly. For a brief moment, she was hit by a wave of vertigo that made her hold on to him tighter than necessary. His immediate response was to hold her closer in an effort to steady her. Their eyes locked, and there it was, something raw and unplanned that seeped through their rehearsed smiles. A spark ignited in that moment. It was fleeting, but potent enough to make her heart skip a beat. It wasn't part of the script or any elaborate plan. It was real and exciting. Catching both of them off guard, they quickly broke apart as soon as he put her down. They laughed it off for the cameras, but couldn't dismiss what had just transpired between them. As the day wore on and shots continued under different backdrops, the pier, beachside cafe, and finally against a setting sun, they found themselves drawn towards each other, even when cameras weren't rolling. They shared soft conversation over coffee during breaks, or simply sat together enjoying comfortable silence while watching waves crash against sandy shores. There was an undeniable ease between them now which didn't go unnoticed by others around them. Over dinner at a nearby restaurant after wrapping up for the day, Grace found herself wrestling with the feelings that had been stirred at the beach earlier. She couldn't quite put a finger on what it was, but something about their relationship had undeniably shifted. There was an undercurrent of something more than just friendship, a feeling that caught her off guard. Liam, on the other hand, seemed uncharacteristically quiet during dinner. His mind, too, seemed to be elsewhere as he played with his food more than he ate it. When she asked if everything was okay, he shrugged and gave her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Their ride back to their respective homes was filled with unspoken tension and an unusual silence. As they bid each other goodnight, they shared a lingering glance which held a promise to address this change soon. Chapter 5. In the aftermath of their unexpected moment on the beach, Grace found herself wrestling with her newfound feelings for Liam. She turned to her best friend, Marianne, seeking advice over a cup of coffee in the quiet corner of a Beverly Hills cafe. "You sure it's not just because you have to spend so much time together?" Marianne asked, sipping her cappuccino. Grace ran a hand through her hair, pushing back loose curls from her face. "I wish it were that simple," she admitted. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee mug while she contemplated how to put her feelings into words. It felt like trying to capture a sunrise with a paintbrush. No matter how vibrant or true to life the colors were, they would never do justice to the real thing. Finally, she said, "It's like I'm seeing him in a whole new light. He's not just the bad boy Hollywood has typecast him as. There's so much more to him. His passion for acting, his genuine kindness, and I think I'm falling for him." Marianne studied Grace closely before responding with an air of caution. "Grace," she began gently, "you know better than anyone how this industry can blur lines between what's real and what's not. Are you sure it isn't simply proximity?" Her words hung heavily between them, stirring an uncomfortable silence that was broken only by the clatter of dishes from another table. "I don't know," Grace confessed finally. Her voice conveyed uncertainty and frustration at herself for not knowing what these emotions meant or where they might lead. "Maybe," Marianne suggested hesitantly, while reaching across the table to grasp Grace's hand comfortingly. "Maybe you should take some time apart from Liam, just enough to clear your head." Even though Grace knew her friend was right, the thought of distancing herself from Liam made her heart ache with an intensity she had not anticipated. She nodded nonetheless, promising to consider the advice. Meanwhile, Liam was in his high-rise penthouse suite, wrestling with his own feelings for Grace. He sat on the balcony, a glass of whiskey in hand, overlooking the cityscape that spread out beneath him like a vast ocean of twinkling lights. His mind whirred with thoughts of Grace, his gut clenched at the memory of their shared moment on the beach. He had always maintained a certain detachment from his co-stars, carefully drawing a line between his professional and personal life. But with Grace, it seemed as if those lines were smudging into an indistinguishable blur. As he sipped slowly on his drink, he pondered over what these newfound emotions meant. The thought of admitting these feelings to himself was daunting enough. Sharing them with Grace felt terrifyingly vulnerable. Liam had always been seen as Hollywood's charming playboy, unaffected by love and untamed by commitment. This image was one he'd cultivated carefully over years to keep people at bay, an armor against emotional pain or rejection. He took another swig from his glass before placing it on the table beside him. Leaning back in his chair, he let out a sigh that echoed in the silence of the night. A part of him wanted to dismiss these emotions as mere infatuation, a fleeting attraction towards someone he shared close quarters with. Yet another part knew better. It recognized the depth of these emotions, which went beyond mere physical attraction or friendliness born out of necessity. Grace Montrose had unknowingly breached his defenses and found her way into places within him that no other woman had ever reached. His respect, admiration, and now possibly his heart. As intimidating as this realization was, it also held an allure that was hard to resist. Yet despite this internal struggle, Liam knew better than to act impulsively based on such complicated emotions. He decided he needed time to figure out his feelings for Grace, to understand if they were real or just a mirage created by their unusual circumstances. As the night deepened into the early hours of morning, Liam found himself still sitting on the balcony, lost in thoughts of Grace and the emotions that she had unwittingly spun around him. With a heavy heart, he finally trudged back inside, leaving behind the city lights and his whirlwind of thoughts under the starlit sky. As days turned into weeks, their once flourishing relationship was replaced by an uncomfortable distance. Grace busied herself with auditions and script readings while Liam threw himself into late-night rehearsals and social events. Yet, no matter how hard they tried to bury themselves in work, the absence of each other's company hung heavily around them like a shroud. The red carpet events and staged photo shoots that had been a catalyst for their unexpected friendship now seemed hollow without the shared jokes and whispered conversations between them. Their smiles for the camera lacked the earlier warmth. Their poses felt mechanical rather than intimate. One evening after yet another lackluster event, Grace found herself walking along the deserted beach near her apartment. The moon cast a silver glow on the waves that lapped gently at her feet, reflecting her tumultuous emotions. She remembered Marianne's words about taking some time apart from Liam, but it hadn't brought any clarity as she had hoped. If anything, it only amplified her longing for him, his comforting presence, his light-hearted banter, even his passionate discussions about acting. She missed it all. Chapter 6. The Los Angeles sun was beginning to set when Grace pulled up to Liam's penthouse. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of nerves and fear swirling within her. She had spent the entire day rehearsing what she would say, going over every word like a script for a scene. But this wasn't a director yelling action, there were no second takes. She took a deep breath as she knocked on his door, the city's skyline casting shadows over the room. Liam opened the door, surprise flickering across his face before it settled into confusion. "Grace, is everything okay?" he asked, stepping aside as she walked into his apartment. "I need to talk to you," Grace said quietly, avoiding his gaze. Liam nodded cautiously, closing the door behind him before leading her towards the sleek black leather couch that sat facing an expansive window overlooking downtown LA. He sat down next to her, their knees brushing slightly. The proximity made Grace's heart flutter nervously in her chest, but she pushed it aside, focusing on why she was here. "Liam, She began hesitantly, then stopped, unsure how to begin. Taking another deep breath, she turned towards him, meeting his curious gaze with determination. "I've been trying to deny it for weeks now, but I can't anymore." Worried lines creased Liam's forehead as he took a moment before asking carefully, "Deny what exactly?" Grace swallowed hard before whispering softly, "My feelings for you." There was silence in the room as Liam stared at her wide-eyed and speechless. His disbelief cut through the tension, making Grace wince inwardly. "Liam, I know this is out of blue, but I needed you to know," she admitted earnestly, feeling vulnerable under his scrutinizing gaze, yet relieved that she'd finally spoken up. "But this is all, it's just an act," Liam stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Grace admitted, "and it started that way. But somewhere along the line, things changed for me. You became more than just a co-star or a fake boyfriend. You became someone I genuinely care about." She watched him closely as she confessed her feelings, his face unreadable, making her heart thump loudly in her chest. Liam sat there for what felt like an eternity, his face a mask of bewilderment. His blue eyes, usually brimming with charm, were wide and uncertain. The silence in the room was deafening as Grace held her breath, waiting for him to say something, anything. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Grace, He swallowed hard, breaking eye contact and running a nervous hand through his hair. He looked like a man drowning in confusion. "I'm sorry, Liam," Grace said softly, feeling a painful lump form in her throat at his reaction. "I didn't mean to make things complicated." "No, it's not that," Liam murmured, glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "It's just, I wasn't expecting this." "Neither was I," Grace confessed quietly. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for release. She wanted to run from the room and hide from the vulnerability that was now on full display between them. But before she could even move from her spot, Liam surprised her by reaching out and gently taking her hands into his own. His touch sent shivers down her spine, but gave her an unexpected sense of comfort too. "I need time," he finally said after another long moment of silence. "Time to wrap my head around this." His words stung more than she would have liked to admit, but Grace nodded understandingly. A small part of her had hoped for reciprocation, but the bigger part knew it wasn't going to be that easy. "I understand," she said softly, pulling away gently from him and standing up abruptly, feeling suffocated all of a sudden. Liam rose too, looking at her apologetically as if he wanted to say something more, but instead let out a sigh, watching helplessly as Grace walked towards the door without another word. As soon as she closed the door behind her, Grace felt a rush of emotions flood through her. She leaned against the wall, her heart heavy with unshed tears. But there was also an undeniable sense of relief that washed over her. She had done it. She had confessed her feelings to Liam, and whatever followed next, be it rejection or acceptance, at least she wouldn't have to live with the regret of not speaking up. Meanwhile, back in his penthouse suite, Liam sank onto his couch, staring blankly at the closed door where Grace had just exited from. His mind buzzed with confusion and surprise as he replayed their conversation repeatedly. "Coward," he said to himself. You're going to mess it all up. What's wrong with you?" He groaned out loud, pressing his hands to his face, feeling overwhelmed by this sudden revelation. He wasn't ready to admit to himself how he felt about Grace yet, but one thing was clear. He needed time to figure things out. Chapter 7. The days following Grace's confession were filled with a silence that echoed louder than any words spoken. Liam had retreated into himself, a shell of the vivacious man she'd grown fond of. His eyes, once full of life and mischief, now held a distant look whenever they met hers. Despite the tension between them, they continued their public appearances as Hollywood's golden couple with half-hearted smiles. During an interview on a popular talk show, Grace found herself stealing glances at Liam, who was expertly dodging personal questions about their relationship. She admired his ability to mask his feelings so effortlessly behind his charming smile, while her own heart felt like it was on display for everyone to see. As they left the studio after the interview, Grace couldn't hold back any longer. She needed to know where they stood with each other. "Liam," she began tentatively as he started the engine of his sleek black Audi. He glanced at her briefly before focusing back on the road ahead. "I think we need to talk," she stated softly, her voice barely audible over the purr of the car engine. Liam remained silent for a moment before finally responding. "I know, Grace." "You have to give me an answer, Liam." I know, he responded. While arriving to her apartment building in West Hollywood, Liam cut off the engine and turned towards her, visibly struggling with what to say next. "Grace, He stalled again, growing frustrated with himself. "I'm still a bit lost, you know. I'm not sure I would be good for you. I wouldn't want to mess it up for us, you know. Just give me a bit more time to figure some things out." "All right, Liam," she responded quietly, forcing a smile. "But I can't wait forever." With that, Grace exited the car and walked away without looking back. As she entered her apartment, she leaned against the door, allowing herself to finally break down. Meanwhile, Liam sat alone in his car outside Grace's apartment building, wrestling with his own thoughts. He replayed their conversation in his mind, the hurt evident in Grace's eyes as he'd asked for more time. A part of him wanted nothing more than to chase after her and tell her that he felt the same, that he too was helplessly falling for her despite everything. But fear held him back, fear of the commitment and fear of losing not only a friend but someone who had come to mean more than he had ever anticipated. As he drove off into the night, Liam couldn't shake off the feeling that he'd made a grave mistake by not telling Grace how he felt right then and there. Chapter 8. Liam Stone had always been good at pretending. He had spent his life in front of the camera, slipping into characters as easily as one would slip into a well-tailored suit. But as he stood alone in his suite, he realized that pretending was no longer an option. He had made a mistake in denying his feelings for Grace Montrose. The quiet emptiness of his apartment seemed to echo his loneliness. He missed her, the sound of her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about acting, even their heated debates over script interpretations. He missed his friend, his confidant, who had unexpectedly become more than just a professional convenience. A week had passed since Grace's heartfelt confession, and every day without her felt like eternity. He needed to make amends, but was unsure how to go about it. When you've spent so much of your life behind masks, authenticity can be daunting. As he paced around his living room, he glanced at the invitation card on the coffee table, to an awards ceremony scheduled for tomorrow night, an occasion where Hollywood's elite would gather under one roof to celebrate talent and success. An idea began to form in Liam's mind, an audacious plan that held potential risks and humiliation, but also hope. But it was too perfect to pass up. He picked up the invitation card as determination settled within him, like an anchor grounding a drifting ship. It was time to take a leap of faith for himself, for Grace, and for what could possibly be their future together. As the city below carried on its nocturnal life, Liam prepared himself for what lay ahead. Amidst the glitz and glamour of Hollywood's biggest night, Liam Stone, the charismatic actor known for his indifferent attitude towards love, was ready to bare his heart. The prospect was terrifying yet thrilling, just like falling in love itself. But one thing was certain: he had fallen hopelessly in love with Grace Montrose, and it was time everyone knew about it. Finally retiring to bed after a restless evening, Liam fell asleep with dreams colored by Grace's smile and the hope of a shared tomorrow, an anticipation that made his heart flutter despite the fear of rejection. The awards ceremony was a glittering affair, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of expensive perfume. Liam Stone stood amidst the sea of tuxedos and gowns, his heart pounding in his chest. He kept stealing glances at Grace Montrose, radiant in a silken gown that hugged her figure elegantly. She looked beautiful, yet there was an unmistakable sadness in her eyes which he knew he was responsible for. As the evening proceeded, accolades were won and speeches were made, but none of it registered with Liam. His thoughts were consumed by Grace and the grand gesture he was about to make. Finally, when it was time for him to present an award, he ascended the stage amid applause. The crowd hushed as he took hold of the microphone. His gaze scanned over the audience before finally settling on Grace, who looked at him expectantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Liam began, his voice steady despite his racing heartbeat. "Tonight is not just about celebrating our craft. It's also about celebrating relationships, those we form on sets that last long after the director calls cut." There were nods of agreement from fellow actors while Grace watched him curiously from her seat. "In light of that," Liam continued, his eyes never leaving Grace's face, "I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge someone special." Suddenly, all eyes were on him. The room filled with whispers as people wondered what Liam Stone was up to. "Grace Montrose," he said softly into the microphone, making her gasp audibly as everyone turned to look at her. "Liam," she mouthed silently, but he held up a hand asking for patience from her and silence from others. "We started off as rivals, even hated each other, I'd say," he confessed, eliciting laughter from some audience members while others watched raptly, captivated by the unexpected turn of events. "But over time, we found a connection that I valued dearly," Liam continued, his gaze softening as he looked at Grace, whose eyes were brimming with tears. There was complete silence in the room now. Everyone watched as Liam bared his heart on stage, an intimacy rarely witnessed in such public settings. "I love you, Grace Montrose," he confessed softly, yet clearly into the microphone. His admission echoed through the hall, followed by whispers and gasps from stunned celebrities. Grace sat frozen in her seat, surprise, confusion, and a ray of hope mingling on her beautiful face. She didn't know how to react. Was this another act, or was it real? Liam descended from the stage amidst applause and catcalls towards Grace, who was still rooted to her spot. "Grace," he began, but she interrupted him, raising her hand much like he had done earlier. "No more words, Liam. I need to know if it's real this time," she said quietly, away from the microphone. Liam nodded understandingly, with his signature smile. Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she flung herself into his arms amidst applause and cheers from everyone around them. "I love you too, Liam Stone," she replied softly before pulling him closer for a kiss. A round of applause erupted from the audience. Spotlights swung to Grace, all cameras turned towards the two lovers.